Montana Territory, 1885. The frontier was a place where a man's worth was measured in calluses and scars, not tender feelings. That's what Matthew Caldwell believed as he guided his horse through the Golden Valley toward the growing settlement of Pineridge. At 25, he'd already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The war had taken his father, the drought had claimed their Texas ranch, and the harsh realities of cowboy life had hardened his heart to anything resembling vulnerability. "No room for sentiment out here," he muttered to his Palomino chance as they crested the hill overlooking the town. "Just survival." The early autumn sun cast long shadows across the main street as Matthew rode in, dust clouding around Chance's hooves. His trail-worn appearance, faded blue shirt, weathered leather vest, and hat pulled low marked him as what he was: a drifter, a hired gun, a man who didn't put down roots. Matthew had convinced himself that attachment was a luxury the West didn't allow. Every ranch hand he'd known who'd fallen for a pretty face ended up distracted, making mistakes that got them killed or broke. The West was unforgiving. It demanded full attention. Love was nothing but a distraction that could get you killed. He'd come to Pineridge on the promise of work at the Rocking M Ranch. The owner, Henry Morgan, had put out word he needed experienced hands for a cattle drive north to the railroad. It was temporary work, just the way Matthew preferred it. Get in, earn his pay, move on before anyone got to know him well enough to matter. The town was bigger than he'd expected, a proper main street lined with businesses, a church steeple rising at the far end, and signs of prosperity that had bypassed many frontier settlements. Matthew guided Chance toward the hitching post outside the mercantile, planning to get directions to the Morgan spread. He was dismounting when he heard a commotion from inside the store, raised voices, something crashing to the floor. Matthew's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver as the mercantile door burst open. "I won't tell you again, Miss Barrett. Your father's debts are due, and I'm not running a charity." A barrel-chested man with mutton-chop whiskers stood in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. "Please, Mr. Wilkins, just one more week." "The harvest." "The harvest should have been in already. This is business, not friendship." Matthew watched as a young woman stepped out onto the boardwalk, clutching a small parcel to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 21, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, and a dress of faded blue calico that had seen better days but was meticulously mended. Despite her obvious distress, she maintained a quiet dignity that struck him immediately. "I understand, Mr. Wilkins, I'll find a way." Her voice was soft but not weak, like calm water that ran deep. As she turned away from the merchant, their eyes met briefly. Matthew Caldwell had stared down angry bulls, faced outlaws with steady nerves, and ridden through blizzards without flinching. But in that moment, as the shy girl's hazel eyes connected with his, he felt something he'd never experienced before, like his heart had stumbled in its rhythm, forgetting how to beat properly. She quickly lowered her gaze and hurried past him, the light scent of lavender lingering in her wake. "Women troubles are worse than rattlesnakes," Matthew reminded himself firmly, shaking off the strange sensation. He had no business getting involved in local matters. Yet he found himself watching her retrieve a small wagon at the end of the street, noting the careful way she arranged her meager purchases. "You looking for something, cowboy?" The merchant, Wilkins, had noticed Matthew's attention. "Directions to the Rocking M," Matthew replied, forcing his focus back to his purpose. Wilkins sized him up with a practiced eye. "Morgan Place is about 5 miles north." "You the new hand. If Morgan wants to hire me." The merchant snorted. "He'll hire anyone with a pulse these days. That was Sophia Barrett you were eyeing, pretty thing but trouble. Her pa died last spring, left her with a failing farm and more debt than sense." Matthew didn't appreciate the man's tone, wasn't eyeing anyone, just passing through. "Best way to be in these parts," Wilkins agreed. "No sense getting tangled in other folks' problems." Matthew nodded curtly and remounted Chance. As he rode toward the Morgan ranch, he told himself the girl was already forgotten. But his heart knew otherwise because it still hadn't resumed its normal cadence. The Rocking M was impressive, a sprawling ranch house, solid barns, and well-maintained corrals. Henry Morgan, a gray-haired man with the leathery face of someone who'd spent decades under the sun, hired Matthew on the spot after a few questions about his experience. "We move the herd in 3 weeks," Morgan explained. "Until then, there's plenty to keep you busy. Bunkhouse is over yonder. Cook rings the bell at sunup." Matthew settled into ranch life easily. The work was familiar, mending fences, breaking horses, and preparing for the drive. The other hands were a typical mix of young bucks trying to prove themselves and old-timers with stories longer than Montana winters. He kept to himself mostly, doing his job well but forming no attachments. 2 days after arriving, Matthew rode into town with a couple other hands to pick up supplies. While they headed for the saloon afterward, he found himself wandering toward the mercantile again, telling himself he needed tobacco, nothing more. He was nearly there when he saw her again, Sophia Barrett, emerging from the doctor's office, looking pale and worried. Matthew hung back, watching as she spoke with an elderly woman outside the building. "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson, truly," she was saying. "Dr. Pearson says it's just exhaustion." "You're working that land all alone, child." "It's too much." "What choice do I have? Father believed in that farm, I can't just abandon it." The older woman patted her hand. "There are other choices, dear. Frank Henderson's nephew is coming from St. Louis next month. He's a lawyer with prospects." "Please, Mrs. Henderson," Sophia interrupted gently. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not looking for a husband to solve my problems. Independence won't keep you warm in winter, child." Matthew found himself admiring her stubborn dignity. Most women in her position would have already sold the farm or sought marriage as protection from poverty. He stepped back into the shadow of the gunsmith's shop as she walked past, but not before their eyes met briefly again. This time a faint blush colored her cheeks before she looked away, and again Matthew felt that strange hitch in his chest, as though his heart had momentarily forgotten its purpose. "Fool," he muttered to himself as he watched her go. Getting involved with a local girl with ties to the land was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd always avoided, especially one with troubles. Troubles had a way of becoming your own if you let them. The next Sunday, several of the hands rode into town for supplies and entertainment. Matthew had intended to stay at the ranch, but Morgan had asked him to deliver a message to the blacksmith about some special shoes for his prized stallion. The church service was just letting out as Matthew rode in. He couldn't help but scan the departing congregation, his eyes finding Sophia without even trying. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow that somehow made her look like sunlight itself, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of continued hardship. He was turning away when he saw 3 men approach her. From their fine clothes and the way the largest one gestured emphatically, it wasn't a friendly conversation. Matthew couldn't hear the words, but Sophia's distress was evident in the rigid set of her shoulders. Almost without conscious decision, he found himself guiding Chance closer, just near enough to overhear. "The land is perfect for our railroad spur, Miss Barrett. You'd be doing yourself a favor by selling now," the largest man was saying. His voice was smooth as oil but just as slick. "As I've told Mr. Clayton repeatedly, the farm is not for sale," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "Clayton Enterprises is prepared to be very generous considering the encumbrances on the property." The man smiled without warmth. "We've already purchased the adjoining properties. Yours is the final piece we need." "My answer remains the same, Mr. Thornton." The man named Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your father's debts don't simply disappear, Miss Barrett. We've purchased those notes from several creditors in town. One way or another, that land will be ours." Matthew had heard enough. He guided Chance forward, inserting himself into the conversation with deliberate casualness. "Miss Barrett," he said, tipping his hat as though they were old acquaintances, "I believe you mentioned needing help with that broken fence line today." Sophia's eyes widened in surprise, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." Matthew Caldwell, he extended his hand, which she took after only a moment's hesitation, "from the Morgan Ranch." "Of course, Mr. Caldwell," her smile of relief was genuine. "I had nearly forgotten." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't aware you had hired help, Miss Barrett." Before she could respond, Matthew spoke, "Just being neighborly. Morgan believes in looking out for those nearby." He fixed Thornton with a level gaze that communicated exactly what he thought of men who intimidated young women outside church. The railroad man's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "We'll continue our discussion another time, Miss Barrett. Good day." He and his companions departed with barely concealed irritation. Once they were out of earshot, Sophia let out a long breath. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, though I don't recall us discussing any fence line." Matthew felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Seemed like you could use an interruption. "They're persistent," she admitted. "Clayton Enterprises wants to build a railroad spur through the valley. They've been buying up all the land they can. And you don't want to sell. A shadow crossed her face. That farm was my father's dream. His whole life went into that soil. I can't just give it away, she straightened her shoulders. Besides, I'm managing just fine. Matthew could see the shadows under her eyes that told a different story, but he nodded. Your business is your own, Miss Barrett. Sophia, she corrected, then looked surprised at her own forwardness. Sophia, he repeated, the name feeling somehow significant on his tongue. An awkward silence fell between them, broken when the church bell rang once more. I should go, she said. Thank you again for your assistance. Matthew tipped his hat. Any time. He watched her walk away, telling himself this would be the end of it. He'd done his good deed for the day, yet even as he turned to complete his errand at the blacksmith's, he knew something had shifted inside him. The careful walls he'd built around his heart had developed a hairline crack, and Sophia Barrett had somehow slipped through. Over the next week, Matthew tried to focus on his work at the ranch, but thoughts of Sophia Barrett kept intruding. He told himself it was just concern for someone being bullied by powerful men, the same as he'd feel for anyone in a similar position. But when Morgan sent him to town for supplies the following Saturday, he found himself taking the long road that passed by the Barrett farm. He justified it as simple curiosity, nothing more. The farm was smaller than he'd expected, 40 acres at most, with a modest cabin, a weathered barn, and fields that showed signs of recent tending. As he rode closer, he saw Sophia in the vegetable garden, kneeling among the plants with a basket beside her. Matthew had intended just to ride by, perhaps tip his hat if she noticed him, but when he saw her struggling with the handle of a heavy water pump, he found himself dismounting and approaching the fence. Need a hand with that? He called. Sophia startled, then recognized him. Mr. Caldwell, you're a long way from the Morgan Ranch. Matthew, he corrected, and I was heading to town for supplies. She glanced around at the empty road. This isn't the direct route. No, he admitted, it isn't. Something in his honest response seemed to disarm her wariness. She gestured toward the stubborn pump. It's been sticking since yesterday. I've tried everything I know. Matthew climbed over the fence and approached the pump. Up close, he could see that Sophia's honey-blonde hair had escaped its pins in several places, framing her face in a way that softened her features. Her hands were reddened from work but still graceful. He forced his attention to the pump, working the handle experimentally. Leather gaskets probably dried out, simple enough to fix if you have a replacement. In the barn, she said. My father kept supplies for repairs. Together they walked to the barn, where Sophia pointed out a workbench covered with neatly organized tools and parts. Matthew found what he needed quickly and returned to repair the pump. As he worked, Sophia brought him a cup of water. I appreciate this, she said. Things seem to break faster than I can mend them lately. Running a farm alone isn't easy, Matthew replied, focusing on the pump to avoid looking at her too directly. Her presence was disconcerting in ways he wasn't prepared to examine. No, but it's mine to run. There was that quiet determination again, the same he'd witnessed in town, or at least it will be if I can make the payment to Mr. Wilkins by the end of the month. Matthew finished with the pump and tested it. Water flowed freely. There, that should hold for a while. What do I owe you? He shook his head. Nothing, like I told that railroad man, just being neighborly. Sophia studied him with those clear hazel eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. Most neighborly men around here want something in return, Mr. Caldwell, usually my land or my hand in marriage. Matthew felt heat rise in his face. I'm not most men, Miss Barrett. And I'm not staying around long enough for either. Her expression turned guarded again. Of course, the cattle drive. 3 weeks, then I'll be moving on, always do. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back from the pump. That's the life of a cowhand. It sounds lonely, she said quietly. The simple observation struck him like a physical blow because it was true. The life he'd chosen, or that had chosen him, was desperately lonely. But he'd convinced himself it was safer that way. It's freedom, he countered, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Sophia didn't argue. Instead, she gestured toward the garden. Would you like some fresh vegetables for your trouble? The tomatoes are coming in nicely. Matthew should have politely declined and continued on his way. Instead, he found himself accepting her offer and minutes later, sitting on her porch sharing a simple meal of bread, cheese, and fresh tomatoes. As they ate, Sophia told him about her father, a dreamer who'd brought them west after her mother died, convinced the Montana soil would make them prosperous. Instead, it had broken his health while they struggled to make the farm profitable. He was a good man, she said, gazing out at the land, just not a particularly practical one. He borrowed too much, dreamed too big. And now you're left with his debts. She nodded, and his dreams, that's the harder burden sometimes. Matthew found himself sharing more than he'd intended, about losing his own father in the war, about the Texas drought that had forced him onto the trail at 17. Been moving ever since, he concluded, safer that way. Safer? She questioned gently. Matthew hesitated, then admitted, when you don't put down roots, you don't lose everything when the storm comes. Sophia considered this. But you miss the seasons changing, the harvests, the knowledge that something grew because you tended it. She gestured to the land around them. This soil has my father's sweat in it and now mine. For better or worse, it's part of me. Her words disturbed him more than he cared to admit. He'd spent years convincing himself that attachment to people or places was foolish, dangerous even. Yet here was this slip of a woman, facing impossible odds alone, speaking of connection as though it were strength rather than vulnerability. I should get to town, he said, finally standing. Morgan will be wondering where I am. Sophia walked him to where Chance was tied. Thank you for fixing the pump, Matthew. The sound of his name and her voice did strange things to his composure. Like I said, just being neighborly. As he rode away, Matthew told himself firmly that he would not take the long road past the Barrett farm again. The West was no place for sentiment, and he had no business involving himself in Sophia's struggles. Yet even as he made this resolution, he knew it was already crumbling like dry creek bed under summer sun. 2 days later, a fierce storm swept through the valley. The ranch hands worked through the night to secure buildings and calm frightened horses. By morning, the worst had passed, leaving behind fallen trees and muddy fields. Matthew was helping clear debris from a corral when Morgan approached him. Caldwell, take a ride out and check on the eastern properties. Make sure none of our strays ended up on neighboring land. It was a reasonable request, one that wouldn't normally have quickened Matthew's pulse. But the Barrett farm lay to the east, and despite his resolution, he found himself eager for an excuse to ride that way. The storm had left its mark across the countryside. Matthew passed several properties where farmers were already at work repairing fences and roofs. When he reached Sophia's farm, his concern deepened. A large oak had fallen against the barn, damaging the roof. He could see her attempting to drag broken branches away from the garden, her dress mud-splattered and hair wild from exertion. Without hesitation, Matthew rode down the lane. Sophia looked up at his approach, relief washing over her tired features. The barn, she said by way of greeting, gesturing helplessly at the damage. If it rains again before I can repair it. Matthew dismounted, assessing the situation. You have tools. Yes, but I can't manage the roof alone. You don't have to. For the next several hours, they worked together clearing debris and salvaging what materials they could from the damaged portion of the roof. Matthew climbed up to secure tarps over the worst sections, promising to return with proper lumber when he could obtain it. As the day waned, Sophia insisted he stay for supper. It's the least I can offer, she said, and Matthew found he had no will to refuse. Inside her small cabin, he was struck by how she had created a home despite her circumstances. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, a patchwork quilt over a rocking chair, shelves of well-worn books, small touches that spoke of a life built with care rather than merely survived. Over a simple stew, they talked more freely than before. Matthew found himself telling her about places he'd seen, cattle drives he'd survived, the beauty of sleeping under stars in 6 different territories. You make it sound almost romantic, Sophia said, refilling his coffee cup. Matthew chuckled. Dusty, dangerous, and bone-wearying is more accurate. But yes, there are moments when the land stretches out forever and the sky is so big you feel like you might just dissolve into it. Those are worth the hardships. I've never been farther than Helena, she admitted. Father always promised we'd travel once the farm was established, but dreams have a way of getting deferred, Matthew finished for her. Their eyes met across the table, and in that moment Matthew felt a connection deeper than any he'd allowed himself in years. Sophia Barrett was not just a pretty face or a damsel in distress. She was a woman of remarkable strength, carrying burdens that would have broken many men, yet still finding beauty in her confined world. As twilight deepened, Matthew knew he should return to the ranch, yet leaving proved harder than expected. "I'll be back tomorrow with lumber for the barn," he promised at the door. "Morgan owes me a day off anyway." Sophia touched his arm lightly. "Thank you, Matthew, not just for the help but for seeing me. Most people look at me and see only a burden or a potential wife." "You say me." The simple truth of her words resonated deep within him. He did see her, perhaps more clearly than he'd allowed himself to see anyone in a very long time. "Good night, Sophia," he said softly, resisting the unexpected urge to brush a stray lock of honey-blonde hair from her cheek. Riding back to the ranch under a sky washed clean by the storm, Matthew confronted the uncomfortable realization that his carefully constructed walls were crumbling. The West might be no place for sentiment, but his heart had apparently not received that message. True to his word, Matthew returned the next day with lumber borrowed from the ranch and the blessing of Morgan, who seemed amused by his hand's sudden interest in helping a neighboring farmer. "Barrett girls got half the county trying to court her," Morgan had commented. "Didn't figure you for the settling type, Caldwell." "Just being neighborly," Matthew had replied, the excuse wearing thin even to his own ears. He spent the day repairing Sophia's barn roof, conscious of her presence below as she cleared the garden and tended to her few animals. They worked in comfortable tandem, breaking for a midday meal under the shade of an apple tree. "Why did you really come to Pineridge?" Sophia asked as they shared bread and cheese. Matthew considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. "Running, I suppose, not from the law," he added quickly at her raised eyebrow. "From memories, maybe, from getting too comfortable anywhere." "And how's that working for you?" There was gentle challenge in her voice. He met her gaze. "Not as well as it used to." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to voice. Instead, they returned to their respective tasks, yet Matthew was acutely aware of a shift between them, as though some invisible barrier had dissolved. That evening, as he prepared to leave, Sophia walked with him to where Chance was tied. "The cattle drive is in 2 weeks," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes." "Will you come back to Pineridge, I mean?" Matthew hesitated. The honest answer was that he had never planned to, never returned anywhere once he'd moved on. Yet now, the thought of riding away from this valley, from her, created an ache he couldn't easily dismiss. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been one to backtrack." Disappointment flickered across her features before she composed them again. "Of course, the cowboy's life is forward motion." Sophia, he wasn't sure what he wanted to say, only that he couldn't bear the sadness in her eyes. "It's all right, Matthew, I understand, truly." She straightened her shoulders. "Thank you for fixing my barn, I won't forget your kindness." He wanted to tell her it was more than kindness that brought him back to her farm, more than neighborly duty that made him memorize the exact shade of her eyes or the way her voice softened when she spoke of things she loved. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he mounted Chance and rode away, feeling as though he were leaving something essential behind. Over the next week, Matthew threw himself into preparations for the cattle drive. The rocking hands were gathering the herd, inspecting each animal, and ensuring the chuck wagon was properly stocked. It was exhausting work that should have left no room for thoughts of honey-blonde hair or hazel eyes that saw too much. Yet Sophia Barrett had taken up residence in his mind, challenging every conviction he'd built his wandering life upon. Each night in the bunkhouse, as the other hands played cards or shared stories, Matthew found himself staring at the ceiling, wrestling with unfamiliar longings. The West had taught him harsh lessons about attachment, people left through death, betrayal, or simple circumstance. Putting down roots meant exposing yourself to loss. For 8 years, he'd protected himself by remaining in motion, never staying long enough for anyone to matter too much. But Sophia mattered. Against all logic and self-preservation, she mattered. 5 days before the cattle drive was set to begin, Matthew rode into town for final supplies. He'd avoided the Barrett farm since repairing the barn, telling himself it was for the best. Clean break, no complications. In the mercantile, he was selecting coffee and tobacco when he overheard Wilkins speaking to another customer. "Clayton's giving her until tomorrow to accept their offer," Wilkins was saying. "After that, they foreclose on the loans they've bought up. Shame, really. Barrett was a fool, but the girl's done her best." Matthew's hand froze over the tobacco tin. "You talking about Sophia Barrett?" he asked, turning to face the merchant. Wilkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Private business conversation, Caldwell." "Doesn't sound private if you're discussing it in your store." Matthew moved closer. What's this about foreclosure? The other customer, a rancher Matthew recognized from town gatherings, spoke up. Clayton Enterprises has bought up all of Barrett's outstanding debts. Word is they're calling them due tomorrow unless the girl sells them the property for their railroad. Can they do that? Wilkins shrugged. Legally, yes. Morally, well, that's another question. But business is business. Matthew felt a cold anger building. What's the total of the debt? Not your concern, Cowboy, unless you're thinking of courting the girl yourself. Wilkins gave a knowing smile that made Matthew's fists clench. The amount, he repeated flatly. Perhaps something in his expression convinced Wilkins not to push further. Near $600, more than she'll ever raise farming that poor soil. $600. Matthew had almost that much saved from 2 years of careful work, money he'd been setting aside for, what, some vague future that kept receding before him like a mirage. Without another word, he paid for his supplies and left, mounting chance with quick efficiency. But instead of heading back to the Rocking M, he turned toward the Barrett farm, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never before considered. He found Sophia in the field, harvesting what vegetables had survived the storm. When she saw him approaching, she straightened, pushing back her bonnet to shield her eyes from the late afternoon sun. Matthew, she said, his name a question in itself. He dismounted and crossed to her, suddenly uncertain how to begin. I heard in town about Clayton buying your debts. Her face fell. News travels fast. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what, that I'm about to lose everything, her voice cracked slightly. That despite all my work, my father's dreams are slipping through my fingers. What good would telling you do? I could help. Sophia shook her head. I don't need charity, Matthew. It's not charity, he stepped closer. I have savings, almost enough to cover the debt. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with something like anger. And what would you want in return? The land, a wife. I told you I'm not looking to solve my problems by. Nothing, Matthew interrupted. I don't want anything from you, Sophia. Everyone wants something. Maybe once I did too. Maybe I thought the West had taught me that attachment was weakness, that caring for anyone or anything would only lead to pain. He gestured around at her farm. But you've shown me something different. The strength in putting down roots, in fighting for something that matters. Sophia stared at him, confusion evident in her expression. I don't understand, you're leaving in less than a week. The cattle drive. I don't have to go, the word surprised him as much as her. Morgan would understand if I stayed. Stayed, she whispered, why would you stay? Matthew took a deep breath. Because for the first time in 8 years I've found someone, that makes me want to stop running. Sophia's eyes filled with tears. Don't say such things unless you mean them, Matthew. I've had enough broken promises in my life. I mean it. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her work-roughened hand in his. I don't know what this is between us, Sophia. I only know that the thought of riding away from you feels wrong in a way nothing else ever has. A tear slipped down her cheek. And if I lose the farm anyway? Then we'll figure out what comes next, together if you'll have me. You barely know me, she protested weakly. Matthew smiled. I know enough. I know you're stubborn and proud and stronger than anyone gives you credit for. I know you see beauty where others see only hardship. I know my heart stops when you look at me in that way you're looking at me right now. Sophia's free hand rose to her mouth, but not before he caught the tremulous smile forming there. Stay, she whispered, help me fight for this place. It was all the invitation Matthew needed. He gathered her gently into his arms, feeling as though he'd finally come home after a journey he hadn't even known he was on. The next morning, Matthew rode into town with determination and nearly $600, his life savings secured in his saddlebag. At the bank, he found not only Wilkins but also Thornton from Clayton Enterprises, apparently ready to execute their plan. I'm here to settle Sophia Barrett's debts, Matthew announced without preamble. Thornton's eyebrows rose. Mr. Caldwell, isn't it? This is an unexpected development. The amounts and to whom they're owed, Matthew insisted, ignoring the railroad man's surprise. The banker, a thin man named Prescott, produced a ledger. Miss Barrett owes $486 to various creditors, all of which have been purchased by Clayton Enterprises. Less than I'd feared. Matthew counted out the money carefully. This is highly irregular, Thornton protested. Clayton Enterprises has plans for that property that would benefit the entire community. A railroad spur would bring prosperity. You'll need to find another route, Matthew interrupted, pushing the money across to Prescott. Miss Barrett's not selling. Thornton's face darkened. This is temporary at best, Caldwell. A cowhand's savings won't keep that farm afloat forever. She'll be in debt again by winter. Matthew met the man's gaze steadily. Maybe, but that'll be our problem to solve, not yours. Our problem. The words felt right in a way that surprised him. For so long, he'd avoided entanglements of any kind, convinced that the lone rider survived while the man with attachments perished. Now he was willingly, eagerly, even tying his fate to Sophia's. After completing the transaction and obtaining receipts proving the debts paid, Matthew rode back to the Barrett farm. He found Sophia on the porch, her face lined with worry that melted into disbelief as he explained what he'd done. "You paid it all?" she asked, hands trembling as she examined the receipts. "But your savings." "Best investment I ever made," he said simply. Sophia shook her head in wonder. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Thornton was right about one thing. The farm needs work to be truly profitable." "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is." She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "Are you certain about this, Matthew, about staying?" In answer, he closed the distance between them, one hand gently cradling her face. "More certain than I've been about anything in my life." Their kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a promise that needed no words. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I need to tell Morgan I won't be making the cattle drive," he said, "and there's something else I want to discuss with him too." Later that day, Matthew found Henry Morgan inspecting cattle in the north pasture. The rancher listened without interruption as Matthew explained his decision to stay in Pineridge and his reasons for doing so. When he finished, Morgan surprised him with a knowing smile. "Wondered how long it would take you to figure it out." "Figure what out, sir?" "That you've been running from belonging somewhere for so long you almost missed recognizing home when you found it." The older man clapped him on the shoulder. "Barrett girl's got spirit. You'll need it, partnered with someone as stubborn as yourself." Matthew hesitated. "There's something else. I was hoping you might consider a business arrangement." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of arrangements?" "The Barrett farm has good water and pasture potential, but not enough acreage to be profitable with just crops. If we could graze some of your cattle there, share the profits." The rancher considered this. "Could work, been thinking about expanding eastward anyway." He studied Matthew with shrewd eyes. "You're serious about this girl then, about putting down roots?" "Yes, sir, I am." Morgan nodded slowly. "Then I wish you luck, Caldwell. The wandering life has its freedoms, but a man needs something to come home to. Took me too many years to learn that myself." They worked out a basic agreement that would allow Matthew and Sophia to run a small herd on their land, with the Rocking M providing the initial stock in exchange for a percentage of the calves. It wasn't wealth, but it was a start, a foundation they could build upon together. When Matthew returned to the Barrett farm, their farm now in his mind, he found Sophia planting late-season vegetables in the garden. She straightened as he approached, a question in her eyes. "Morgan agreed," he said simply. "We'll start with 20 head, build from there." The smile that bloomed across her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "So we're really doing this, becoming partners." Matthew took her hands in his, dirt-stained and all. "I was thinking of a more permanent arrangement, actually." Sophia's breath caught. "Matthew." "I know it's fast," he admitted. "Too fast, maybe. But I've spent 8 years running from connection, Sophia. Now that I've found it with you, I don't want to waste another day." "Are you asking me to marry you?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Inelegantly, but yes," he smiled ruefully. "I'm not offering wealth or an easy life. Just my hands, my heart, and a promise to face whatever comes beside you, not riding away when things get difficult." Tears filled her eyes, but they were accompanied by a smile that stole his breath. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew Caldwell." 3 weeks later, they stood before the preacher in Pineridge's small church. The ceremony was simple, Sophia in a dress of pale blue that misses. Henderson had helped her alter from her mother's wedding gown, Matthew in the only suit he owned, purchased in Helena for the occasion. Morgan stood as Matthew's witness, while several local women who had befriended Sophia over the years gathered to support her. Even Wilkins attended, perhaps out of curiosity as much as community spirit. As they spoke their vows, Matthew marveled at how completely his life had transformed in just over a month. The man who had ridden into Pineridge, convinced that attachment was folly, now pledged himself willingly, joyfully, to this woman who had shown him that roots could be strength rather than weakness. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared, and Matthew kissed his bride with a sense of homecoming he'd never before experienced. The small reception at their farm, truly theirs now, was modest but joyful. Neighbors brought food and good wishes, Morgan contributed a fine beef for the celebration, and even the weather cooperated with a perfect autumn day. As twilight fell and the last guests departed, Matthew and Sophia stood on their porch, his arm around her waist as they gazed out at their land. "Happy?" he asked softly. Sophia leaned into him. "Happier than I ever thought possible." She turned in his embrace to face him. "When you rode into town that day, I never imagined that a drifter with no plans to stay would find his heart stopping at the sight of a shy girl." Matthew completed her thought. "I never knew love could happen this way either." "I'm glad you stopped running," she whispered. Matthew kissed her gently. "I'm glad you gave me something worth staying for." As stars appeared above their small farm, Matthew Caldwell knew with absolute certainty that the lessons of his past had been incomplete. The West might be harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place where unexpected grace could be found, where a man convinced that attachment meant vulnerability could discover that true strength came from joining his life to another's. Together with Sophia, he had found not just a place to belong but a future to build. The journey ahead would not be easy. The West offered no guarantees, but they would face it side by side, two hearts beating in unison under the vast Montana sky.